June. We're looking at the zero carbon bill. Now, all of you possibly know about the zero carbon bill, which is around our achievable goals and working towards those so that by 2050 we're zero carbon. It's a big ask, it's an important ask, it's a useful piece of legislation to give us the way to get there. Because in this country, 46% of our greenhouse gases, we'll call them, is methane, and it is based in the agriculture industry. So that's whether that be cows or whether it be getting milk to farm, milk off farm or whatever. So that's a massive ask for us. We are unique in the world, and that's what we look like. So it's really important that we get that right. So there will be some massive, major part of work. And I'd like to encourage you all to engage in that, excuse me, to engage in that, to make submissions, to have the conversations around how you see us getting there and what some of the suggestions might be. If 9% of waste or emissions are potentially food and production, I'm kind of working on that, or we as a select committee kind of working on that. We need everyone to commit, to come up with ideas and suggestions. We're around the zero carbon bill. We're also working on reform of the RMA, some small tweaks first and then some massive tweaks. So we're talking the small tweaks that are fixing stuff that's actually quite ridiculous. But the big part of the work will be the changes to the RMA, and you'll have it right. Oh, yes?
Sorry, what's the RMA? Just to quickly define it. What does that stand for?
Oh, very sorry. The Resource Management Act.
Cool.
Yeah. So the Resource Management Act is the piece of legislation that tells us about land use across the country, and very interestingly, potentially around water use, including at Motiti, how we manage our seas. But I digress. So that's a massive piece of work, and we have a coalition government, so that climate change work is happening under James Shaw from the Green Party, and it's really awesome because we've got all this expertise across our government. RMA, climate change. What's the other massive piece of legislation I'm missing here? Looking at you, Claire, sorry. I don't know what I just had in mind blank, but I can look it up, but no, never mind. And so the reality is, as a government, we are, I will talk about the fact that we have stopped offshore drilling. So that was a piece of legislation that we worked on in a very short time frame, very short time frame, around Taranaki. So the sky is apparently going to be falling, that we have actually done this, but we've done it in a way that enables people to genuinely transition from oil and gas into alternatives. And it's really important that we did that in a way that was a just transition. Although people will tell you, because essentially we had a very short set of processes around doing that it wasn't just. However, the existing opportunities to drill last for the next 30 to 40 years. So we've post that, and there is a massive amount of seabed, etc., where this can still occur, which in my opinion is not ideal, but it is just in terms of how we move forward for those people in that industry. We've got some really exciting technologies coming up, and we've put 100 million into green technologies and identifying how we work in ways and thinking of really positive movements forward in terms of innovation, etc. We're putting in an increasing the EV, electric vehicles, and making sure that there is a massive infrastructure to support that, because of course you have to plug it in at some point. Although new technology I've just heard about says that it's a self-driving, there's some new self-driving stuff, so I expect to see some more about that. We're also looking at hydrogen, which is going to be really interesting in terms of multimodal opportunities. And I guess for me, one of the things that's really exciting is that nothing is off the table. We're really clear about we need to make a change to 100% renewable energy in this country. We need to limit what we're doing in terms of our oil and gas. We need to limit what we're doing in terms of our emissions. We need to work out a way that's we have a balance and an equal opportunity to look after our environment and ensure that the economies stay strong. But one won't be at the expense of the other, and I think that that's really important because essentially, if we don't look after our environment, we have no future. We have no future. If our food supply breaks down, if our food chains break down, if our homes are inundated, the sea, etc. We actually, if we have poisoned earth, if our water tables become flooded and we're salinated, etc., we've got some real issues. So these are things that we have to focus on and do. And if we don't, there's going to be some pretty scary stuff coming. I guess the other thing in terms of so that's sort of climate change, but I guess the other thing that I'm really pleased about, I'm really excited about, is the fact that we've put money back into conservation. And the reason I say that is because we are very unique in this world, in our country. We have all of these species that no one else has in the world, but a lot of them are endangered. So our DOC money and our conservation money has gone back into actually trying to protect and support those species. So you'll hear about predator-free, I'm sure you know about that stuff. And it's massively important that we continue to put money into the resourcing of our DOC estate and people. So, is there? I mean, I can talk for a very long time, but I'm really passionate about this, and don't get me started on our seabeds and our fisheries and how we can manage that stuff, because that's my other area of passion in the environment, is fisheries and benthic floor health and a whole pile of stuff, but I think I've probably talked enough. Are there any questions that you might? Yes?
I'm wondering if, as a part of, I heard you talking, if I caught the end, you talking about submissions and things like that, to making submissions and how that's important. Have you thought about, or as a party, I guess it is, like incorporating or starting to work on things like citizens' assemblies, where so it's like sort of akin to jury service, where people have time off work and they're paid for it, and it's in a structured like setting where you can have all of the information available to you, because I know that as important as submissions are, people don't make them, and it's not the best way, I guess, to make it feel like your voice is being heard for a lot of people, just writing an email or attending these sorts of things. And like I went to the Zero Carbon Act one, and you know, I know that there's a lot of people that those sorts of things affect that aren't in the conversation because for an array of reasons, but I don't know if that's something that's on the table for being.
Well, did you, oh gosh, what was his name? The chap that's, he came, Eric, someone, came and he did a nationwide tour. And one of the things he talked about was the opportunities to engage in democracy, and you know, people's forums are a really important way to do that. We're not looking at this point, as far as I know, around that, but it's actually an idea that has been in place since Roman times, although of course back then as a citizen you're only a male of a certain age. What I do know is that we're sort of trying to explore ways to engage people better in democracy. And so while I don't have any particular answers for you, there's some really good thinking around that and some really good economic arguments for engagement on that level. Yeah.
Thank you.
I suppose you've got to admit though that government and councils would probably stand up and listen to maybe 1,000 people saying the same thing than to one person actually saying it.
Absolutely.
So, you know, look, how do you get in touch with people of the same mind?
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's also another issue you will probably find with people who think that they're by themselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, Kiri talked about it, that social media ability, but also, I guess, you know, these are the kinds of opportunities as well. So, you know, going, hey, well, let's have a coffee and have a talk more about this, and it becomes a movement that's grown. I'm really grassroots, having come from the refuge movement. We basically all sat down and had coffees and then started, you know, doing protests and things like that. And on that note, you know, I think it's our youth today and their most amazing march that they organised. And unfortunately, of course, the terror attacks overtook that as a news item. But those thousands and thousands of people out there marching around climate and concerns about the environment is just like, we're not alone. It's almost like throwing your head up in the air or something. But absolutely, one of the things that might be really interesting to you all is, you know how we banned plastic bags, single-use plastic bags, and it comes out. So one of the things about that is singly the most popular thing that we have done by far in government. The most popular thing. It's not about working towards eradication of child poverty or increasing the minimum wage or even stopping oil and gas. It's about banning the plastic bag, and that was about the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who wrote to say, please get rid of plastic bags. Now we know that that's not the solution, because it's not just single-use plastic bags. It's a tiny drop. But that is perfect in terms of you know, people making a difference. So many school children, little pictures of little animals being hurt by plastic bags in the sea and stuff. Like literally, we used to have school after school after school come and say, why don't you ban plastic bags? They're bad. And in the end we did. So yeah, long answer, but absolutely. The other thing you can do, if you're particularly interested, is you can go onto Facebook. You can like my MP page, that'd be great, because unlike Kiri, I've got not very many likes on my Facebook page. So there's Angie Warren-Clarke MP. But the other one is go into Parliament, go onto the Parliament website, and you can actually like the Environment website, Parliament website, and then it pops up and will tell you what's happening in that space. Or go into Parliament and just log in and say, hey, I'm really interested in knowing about climate change or the emissions trading scheme or whatever. And it will tell you when submissions open on those things.
So the government know that the biggest polluter is also the biggest company here in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Which is Ontario.
Yeah.
What is the view of the government in trying to fix that problem?
Well, I think, so take the company away for a minute and look at the real and meaningful things that are happening at farm gate, at farm level. So there is a lot of farmers, and there's an intergenerational farmers who are now coming through who are going, actually I want to contribute to improving my waterways, getting my land use right, those kinds of things. So the structure of Fonterra is very different to the ground swell change that's happening at farm gate. So absolutely, we are intending, if at all possible, to pull agriculture, dairy and etc. into the zero carbon bill. What that will look like, I'm not sure right now. Kind of above my pay grade at this point, but I do know it has been, because we have 46% of our emissions come from that sector, so we need to do something. We can't just ignore 46% of the emissions. So there needs to be something significant shift, and it has to happen. But I'm not negotiating that, thank goodness. Is there any other? Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar with the regenerative farming techniques that are occurring in New Zealand at the moment?
Regenerative, did you say? Are they the small farm movement that you're talking about? Is that what you're referring to?
It's using the, what's his name, the Gabe Brown technique, and so it's about changing from agriculture being a very intensive or extensive rate emitter, especially through livestock and then also waste management of animals and such. Regenerative farming practices kind of go further than that last study that came out saying how by reducing your herd size, farmers have the same profit margins as less transport and such. Regenerative goes a step further in the sense of also diversifying your herds, so you're not just doing one monoculture, and allowing for carbon sequestering into the soil, so it could become a carbon negative industry.
Yes, so I guess I personally do, I didn't know that's what it was called, I know a little bit about that. There's a fair few what they call trial farms around, there's one out in Te Puke, which I've been out to visit, which is around using land use and different modes and different land use throughout the farm, so it's hilly right down to flat, and looking at how we use buns and all sorts of things, trees on some area, dairy on some, cows on others, but beef and lamb, and there is massive research that's happening from the balance of research farms, tribal farms around that, which I think is part of our solution. Absolutely, it's around proper land use. It's around intensification of farming has been really negative, and it also has removed us from being connected in with our farms into becoming a big business with 7,000 or 8,000 cows. I don't know if that's a healthy model to have.
Do you see the government investing in changing land use methods? Because you did mention how you didn't want to change too much of the environment, but you also want to keep that income.
So we've just invested in lots more money into Overseer, which is going to be used to manage land use appropriately, and also like, for example, beef and lamb, they've done some massive stuff, massive work, and have a whole sustainability program on how they will operate and use land in a more effective way and things like that. So it's actually not necessarily government doing that, but it's working in partnership with the industries who recognise the issue and actually are the experts, and working with NPI and those kind of big government organisations to do that work. But I think the really important thing is the land and you don't lose money by working sustainably on the land. It's actually a really effective way of farming.
Could I add something to that?
Yeah, please do.
The government does subsidise and invest in a lot of the things you're talking about. For example, there are some great programs around retiring farming land back into native trust forestry, and that's something where the most successful farmers, and some of those exist in this region, and I say this because my uncle is a farmer here and actually won the National Environmental Farm of the Year a few years ago, and has been consulting.
Is he Rick?
No. And has been consulting his government on the zero emissions scheme from a farming perspective and things as well. The most successful farmers who are doing that are doing things and taking the government up on their programs around things like retiring farmland, shifting from monoculture, from mono-intensive use and things like that, and changing fertiliser practices, looking at the different ways in which they rotate between stock crops versus it's just something around food crops and things like that. Yeah. So obviously, absolutely, there's more work to be done, but the government is investing in those things.
There's lots of different opportunities as well, especially the 100 million plus, the billion trees. There's so much going on at the moment, and you don't have to have a big forest that you need to plant. You can just have a particular patch of land or a bit of some trees you want to put on, and there's funds available for that as well. So there's lots of stuff going on.
Can I just say that, some of the things that concern me, especially in terms of climate change, is people interchanging an environmental issue with a climate change issue. And the two things are very, very different. And that worries me a lot when I hear people doing that, and even yourself in the school, interchanging the two. How much oversight is there between what's happening at the governmental level to ensure that what's happening in, say, the environmental issues is actually complementary to what we need to do in terms of climate change? And an example of that, and I had this conversation with other who's that I attend, and we've got to do this, we've got to do that, save the whatever it is that needs saving in the water. But I'm like, okay, but if the temperature goes up, if climate change impacts, and we're looking at 4 degrees warmer, is this creature going to be able to live in its natural environment anyway?
Absolutely.
The answer is no, to get the bloody thing out of here and into a controlled environment so we can at least preserve it. So, at what level is that conversation coming in? Because it's one thing to go, oh, great, we've got all this money into conservation, all this money into, saving a river, saving a tree, saving a cricket or whatever it is that's being saved. But 10 years down the track, it's going to be expired anyway because the actual climatic conditions that allow it to live no longer exist. So that's, I suppose, for me, is one issue. And the other problem I can see potentially happening is between the coordination of the different areas. Climate change is unique in that it impacts on every single sphere of our existence. Food, everything. Water supplies, food supplies. Can we grow? What can we grow? Where is the master list that we can tap into or get from, Food New Zealand or whatever they call it nowadays, that says, okay, we can't grow this, and this anymore, our climate will no longer allow it, but these are the subsistence food crops that can now be grown. Should we be looking now to start, trialling and planting the trees, like breadfruit trees, for example? I've got no idea how long it takes them to grow up and be ready to harvest from, but do we want to start as nurseries planting breadfruit trees so that in 5 years' time we can put them out in the field, because that is the temperature profile of the foodstuffs that we're going to be growing, and not, say, an apple, the type of housing we have, in terms of the architecture.
So there are, I'll answer the second part first, and then the first part second. How's that? So there are two things happening. One is around prevention, the other is, so we're looking at mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is let's stop this, adaptation is how do we manage so that if all those houses, say, have to be abandoned because sea level rise occurs and the infrastructure fails, and there's a whole pile of raw sewage because, you know, we're up another 2 metres or whatever. That's the planning that's happening now. So the two aren't you know, the two are working in tandem together, and so you'll see a lot of local governments working on that stuff at the moment. You'll see insurance companies start to have a little bit of a, maybe we actually can't insure people. And the
Well, I know they already
yeah.
have because I've attended the conferences for the last 2-3 years up in Auckland. So I can tell you now which communities have already been written off by the insurance companies.
Yeah.
But what I'm not being reassured by is hearing any kind of planning coming through for abrupt change. For the, okay, if things actually happen a hell of a lot faster than what the given theory is. I mean, you mentioned the IPCC report in the 12-year window.
Yeah.
The last update in that, we've got 5 years.
Yeah. Yep,
That's a lot of difference that occurred within about 3 months of the report being released.
And so, so I guess what I can say to you is we still have the ability to turn the ship round. There is planning, I'm sure, I don't know. I'm sure there is planning going on around that, if we move into a state of you know, utter breakdown of the environment because of climate change. I don't know what that is, but certainly one of the things that it's important to know is that we're not actually thinking, well, I certainly am, I'm a glass half full. There is the opportunity to turn this around as a world, and we have to actually act. If we don't, and so part of that is actually making direction at a legislative level to ensure that actions occur which will mitigate or support adaptation.
Yeah, I don't doubt there is, but is there like a monitoring or steering committee
Not
that makes sure that all these different strands are actually complementary and working towards that same end goal and not inadvertently working against each other?
Yeah.
I don't see that anybody is deliberately going to be doing something that's going to stuff up the big picture, but inadvertently they might.
Well, I guess...
And, you know, that whole half glass full, half glass empty, I'm similar, but, you know, my take on it is hope for the best, but you prepare for the worst.
Yeah, which
I want to make
believe,
sure that we have preparation
and that's
in place.
sensible. I guess one of the differences, well, one of the things that is happening that's possibly different that's ever been before is that we're in a truly coalition government, which this might sound like a segue, but it's not. So we have the Minister for Conservation and the Minister for Climate Change sitting outside of Cabinet, and the Minister for the Environment sitting in Cabinet. Those three meet absolutely regularly, but also because we've put the environment into our wellbeing budget coming up and environmental issues around wellbeing, it all has to pass through a lens now of, is this good for our environment? Is this going to support our environment thriving? So there is, instead of being ministers working in their little silos around, oh, you know, I just do housing, it's actually all around working better together. And I think that's really important because it's not really ever been, we do a whole of government approach as opposed to just, I'm going to fix the housing crisis, I'm going to fix the roads or whatever. So I can't tell you for certain, but I do know that there is a real emphasis on working collaboratively across portfolios, and this is what the wellbeing budget has brought people into doing, but also under Jacinta's leadership, it's about working in that way anyway. So I hope that sort of answers your question. Okay, I think I can sit down. Thank you, everyone.
Martin, human rights lawyer. There's a lot to say about the environment as well. Thank you very much.
I am going to use some notes, not all of them, don't be scared. And I do just want to actually start with a little reminder or maybe kind of a different perspective on using notes and using even speaking from a speech and things. Don't be too judgmental about people who do that, because we all have different capacities and different capabilities, different levels of mental cognitive abilities and things. And just because somebody is using notes or reading from a speech doesn't mean that they're not being authentic and not giving you their full selves. So be a bit kind of kinder on yourselves and on the people who you listen to about that. So, right, on that note, yeah, I should probably start by telling you who I am. So I'm Claire, I'm an international human rights lawyer. I have spent the last couple of decades living and working around the world on human rights issues, including the right to food, but also the right to health, education, water and sanitation, all those interesting things that actually all really link together and connect together. And it's all about what makes us healthy, happy, safe communities and places to live and communities of people to be around. I actually whakapapa back here to Rotorua, and I recently moved back home to try and make a contribution and walk my talk here locally again. And because all these issues that I worked on, including environment, the food systems and food sustainability, food security, health and education and housing is a big focus of mine as well. These are all issues which we're really at the coalface of, that are really acute issues that are important to our community here in Rotorua. And so I want to thank Organise Aotearoa and Alex for organising this week. It's a great opportunity for us to get together and have a talk about how these issues affect us locally and what the potential for change is. So one of the things that I do quite a bit of work on is helping people to understand how to do advocacy as well, right? How to be an advocate. So in my world, that's how to be a human rights advocate or how to be a human rights defender. But it's actually all just around how do we take these issues that we are concerned about, that we're passionate about, and how do we make change and influence decision makers and actually end up with the communities that reflect who we are, what we want to be, and what we want to look like and feel like. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is why human rights matters to environment issues. So what's the connection there? Because I'm going to be really honest and say I'm not an environmentalist. I care about the environment and I would like to think I do my bit and try, but I'm not an environment expert by any means. I'm a human rights expert. There's a lot of overlaps there, but there's a real reason why I think taking a human rights approach is really valuable and useful and can help us in our quest to create environmental change, to address many of the issues in the environmental movement that concern us, including climate change, which I agree there are some difficulties there often when we speak about these issues. And so I'm going to talk about human rights and environment, why human rights actually matters. I'm going to talk to you about what are some of the human rights issues that I've worked on and that you know, we've been hearing about. Water and food collecting and making sure that we can have food available even if it's not fit to sell, and about rubbish cleanups and things like that. So some of the human rights issues that I'm concerned about or that I'm going to address a little bit and try and bring some of our lessons from the global sphere about how can we see how that impacts us locally, is around food security and food poverty and the right to food, and what that means in terms of what's called food insecurity and food security and building sustainable food systems for our local communities. Part of that is about why we have this crisis in the food industry is the wrong word, but in terms of food and its price and all those different things that interact with food, and why we have a world where we produce more than enough food to feed every single person in the world, yet more than half of the world lives in hunger. So there's a big problem there. And so why and how does that problem come about and how can we address it? Also, another human rights aspect of this stuff which I've worked on and looked at is around what's called climate justice. And that's about taking climate change and looking at it from the perspective of not just the physical and environmental aspects of it, but the human aspects of it as well, the human security issues that are involved with that, and looking at it from a perspective with a social justice or a human rights lens to say, how can we use our justice systems to actually implement the change that we need to address climate change, with climate change being that scientific, physical issue that we have that has all these implications for us as humans, being one part of the implications that climate change brings. One of the other things I want to have a quick look at is who's responsible for this? How do we, when I think about how do we create change, I always think about who do we blame, not from a wanting to place blame perspective, but in terms of these are the actors that we're trying to influence, right? Who has the capacity to make change, because who's responsible for the problems that exist? So then I want to go through a little bit about how we do advocacy. For me, advocacy is a spectrum. So there's a spectrum of different activities or things that we can do. And we've heard some of those from the kind of local level cleanup, the idea of making submissions to parliamentary committees and things. But there's a whole spectrum of activities, and including public awareness raising, consultation with public through public forums, all those kind of things. What are some of those, and how's their value in each, how they all work together? So, yes, that's apparently what I'm going to talk to you about. Yeah, all right. So any questions as we go along, just feel free to let me know. To start with, any questions? No? All right. So why a human rights approach to climate and the environment, to climate change, the environment and things? So traditionally, environmental law and the ways in which we protect the environment has been kind of a separate category, and it's different lawyers, different parliamentarians, different experts, different scientific communities that work on that, as opposed to working on issues around human rights. But there are some real advantages for us to make sure we're really merging those different areas and bringing these communities of experts, the communities of decision makers, the communities who are affected together. And the bottom line reason why that's important is we're all affected by it. We are all the affected communities. There's no such thing as a community of people who are affected by environmental issues and a community of people who want to promote and protect human rights issues. There's some real advantages in being environmental advocates who use a human rights framework for their advocacy. And one of those is that human rights is a legal framework. It's a legal framework with legal obligations, with legal accountability and enforcement mechanisms, and with clear monitoring procedures. Environmental law exists, and it's growing stronger and stronger, and more communities and countries and local councils are putting in place requirements for environmental, even due diligence processes and things like that to be legal obligations. But it's still in general considered a moral imperative, an ethical, desirable thing. It's considered to be something that we must do because we are all affected by it and we're all going to die if we don't. Get our shit together and do something about it. But it doesn't have that same process of accountability and legal framework by itself. If we think about it as a right to environment with a human rights framework, then what we have is the fact that all of our governments, including the government of New Zealand, past and successive and present, have committed as an act of sovereignty on the part of the government, as an expression of the government's sovereignty, have committed us and our legal system to ensure the protection, the respect, protect and fulfilment of human rights. That includes things like the right to life. And the environment affects our right to life, every aspect of our right to life. The right to food, which is a human right. The right to health, and various other different aspects of what make up the things we care about if we're thinking about the right to environment. So it gives us, in terms of the advocacy that we do as organisers and as lobbyists and as community advocates, it means that instead of going to decision makers saying this is a moral imperative, we must do something about it, we're going saying, you already have a legal commitment, a legal obligation that you've voluntarily taken out. So what are we doing to make sure we're living up to that legal obligation? And then if they're not, we have accountability mechanisms to ensure that we can seek redress, that we can enforce that legal obligation. So, obviously as a lawyer, the whole idea of having legal redress and legal obligations is pretty attractive to me, right? But there's a reason for that. It's not just because I'm a nerdy lawyer, it's because these actually have teeth. Now, some of the concerns in international human rights law and things like that, those teeth, they look different to what our domestic legal systems look like. You've all heard about, international law, does it really, work? Or I was laughing to myself when Kiri was talking about karma and things like that, because one of our jokes in international law nerd community is, what is karma? That's what we rely on when international law fails. Right? So maybe not when, I was laughing at she was talking about good karma, and I'm thinking, we use bad karma a lot in international law. But that's actually a real simplification of it, and a bit of a joke, because we do have enforceability mechanisms. We don't have a global police force that's going to go around and arrest the New Zealand government for not having all their ducks in a row when it comes to climate change policy. But we do have different mechanisms that work, including international peer pressure and things like that, which work more effectively with some governments than others, and work really well with a government like, with a country and a government like New Zealand. We like to think of ourselves as that 100% pure image. We like to think of ourselves as being this kind of good member of the international community, a place that people see and respect and know and like, and a place where we're doing the right thing, where, one of the most attractive things to me as a teenager, is to demonstrate how old I am, about the fact I have dual citizenship, I'm half Kiwi, half Australian. Why I embraced my Kiwiness so much was because I was so proud of the decisions that we made around nuclear testing and things like that. And that's part of our cultural identity, right? About how we're the good guys. And so that's part of the teeth of why using an international human rights system for accountability actually has more impact than what we often give it credit for. And that's why people are so concerned about things like the UN Migration Compact, things like that, because they may not always translate the same way into domestic law. We can't take the police force, and sometimes can't, but often can, haul people responsible into courts. But they still have a big impact. People still care and worry about them, and they change the way decision makers make the decisions. Policy makers make the policies, lawmakers make the laws that impact on our lives. So that's one of the main ways that I think human rights is a really interesting framework for us to use. So how do we actually understand these issues as human rights issues? So the environment is a massive area. Oh, no, Angie. I'm sorry. I'm glad everybody got to ask their questions of Angie before she leaves. The life of an MP, from one busy meeting to another.
Sorry,
no problem. So, from a human rights perspective, obviously the right to environment covers so many different aspects to it. I'm going to focus first just on the right to food and issues around food security. So what do I mean by the right to food? And one of the great misconceptions about human rights, particularly issues like the right to food or the right to health, is that if you want to claim the right to health, does that mean that you get to go and ask the government for a free kidney or free kidney dialysis if you need kidney dialysis? Does it mean that our hospitals have to take everybody? Or with the right to food, what does it actually mean? And one of the interesting things is these things do have actual meaning, and meaning in a really practical sense. Now, I say practical sense, but forgive me if I give you the slightly less clear answer first. I want to actually read you what the definition of the right to food is, so that I understand that. All right, so, and where this comes from is I actually spent a number of years working as the legal advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food. So we spent our time travelling around the world doing missions to all sorts of different countries around the world to see what their issues were around the right to food, food security, doing things like touring everything from schools and hospitals and prisons to going out to the farms, talking to the equivalent of National Farmers Federation type bodies, to fisher people, but also the farmers out there on the ground, in the fields, going and looking at their farm equipment and understanding how they actually do their work and things like that, as well as talking with governments, ministers, lobby bodies, and the most important and effective group for change, civil society, which is you guys. And when you're asking about, is there an overarching kind of body or somebody who's actually monitoring all of this and figuring out how it all connects together? Yes, it's you. It's civil society. No government has the capacity to figure out how all these pieces fit together. That's just the reality of it. I wish there was. I wish they did have that ability. It kind of feels like it should be the least that they do, right? Figure out how all these different things interconnect. But the reality is our world and our lives are just too complex. So it's us as civil society, it's you all, it's organisations like Organise Aotearoa, it's conversations like this, it's submissions to parliamentary committees. That's the oversight mechanism. And it's us at the ballot box on election day. That's the ultimate oversight committee. So yeah, that's just that kind of answer to that question. So the definition of the right to food, let's come back to that. I'm just thinking you can probably tell I'm a university lecturer by giving me actual definitions of things, but I think it's important. Okay, so this is where the definition comes from, my work with the Special Rapporteur on Right to Food. This is the definition that we created, and it's been adopted by the United Nations. So by all of our governments, they have recognised this as what we mean by the right to food. And that is, it's the right to have regular, permanent and unrestricted access, either directly or by means of financial purchases, to quantitatively and qualitatively adequate and sufficient food corresponding to the cultural traditions of the people to which the consumer belongs, and which ensures a physical and mental, individual and collective, fulfilling and dignified life free of fear. So just let that line for a moment. So you can see it's drafted by lawyers, right? And a few different clauses there. But that last little bit is what it all comes down to. Human rights, including the right to food and the right to environment, is about freedom from fear. Freedom from fear about how we're going to pay for the food for our kids to eat. How are we going to feed our families? And as you saw with the definition, it relates to the purchasing power, the ability to grow it ourselves, the way it's distributed. It's a community level thing, it's an individual thing, it's all of those things, right? And it's culturally appropriate. All of those different aspects are incorporated in our understanding of what the right to food is. So if we connect that to food security, and what do we mean by food security, there's a real match there, because the definition of food security is that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So this is where I want to bring that idea of food security back to the local level, to what we have right here in Rotorua. Who lives here, or who's come? Okay, there's not actually that many, maybe about half the audience of the locals and rest have come. Okay, maybe there's some connections there, lineage there. Here in Rotorua, 42% of our children live in poverty, meaning they go hungry to school. And there's some amazing organisations like Kaupai Kai and others who are seeking to address that. But the reality is, within our own community here in Rotorua, we have more than one suburb where the average annual income is no more than 20,000 New Zealand dollars. Just have to think about that. It's actually $10,000 to $20,000 annual income. How can you feed yourself on $10,000 a year, let alone your children? And this is why almost half of our town lives in hunger. Now, we're surrounded by farmland. How is that possible? And this is why when we think about the concept of the right to food as being this intellectualized concept, the reality of it is about thinking about how can we make sure that people don't live in that fear? How can we make sure that we are addressing issues around food provenance, which is one of the causes of the food crisis? So every day there's between 70 to 100 trucks that come into Rotorua to bring our food in, right? So one of the things that I've worked on internationally is how do we ensure that governments are either incentivising, removing barriers, promoting ways in which we can grow food locally, ways in which we can support subsistence farming, small-scale land owners or landholders to ensure that we're farming and growing and breeding the food locally that we need to live on. And that means that safe, healthy, nutritious, culturally appropriate, long-term sustainable diet that we all need. So that's some of the aspects around the right to food, what it is. Let me I started to touch on, in terms of food provenance, some of the aspects around what we mean by the reasons why we have this food crisis. Why are we not living in a state where we don't have to worry about the right to food because the right to food is being realised for all of us? Where's that disconnect? Why are we falling down there? And if we think about the food crisis, that I talk about food crisis, we had this big issue about 10 years ago where we had call it a global disaster. In fact, the UN experts that I work with, we were calling it not just a humanitarian crisis, but actually a humanitarian crime, a crime against humanity. Now, as a legal advisor, I wouldn't go that far, but it did get the media attention to say this is a crime against humanity, that children are dying of malnutrition, that they're turning up to school hungry, that they don't have the nutrition they need to develop to be adults who can make a contribution to the economic life and the cultural life of our countries. The reasons why it became such a big issue about 10 years ago was because of this conglomeration of the 3 Fs: the global financial crisis, the global fuel crisis, and I've just now forgotten the other one. Please forgive me for that, which is why we have notes that are slightly better organised than mine. But let me start on the financial crisis. That's something which is still affecting the food security that we have now. So although the housing industry recovered and we're now on the tail end of the next cycle of that phase, the whole concept of people's wages not covering cost of living, CPI, the inflation, meaning that it costs, that we are not living the same quality of life and standard of living that our parents and our grandparents lived, because it costs us more to live than it costs them to live. We're still feeling the effects of that, and that was something which really hit us in the late 2000s with the global financial crisis. That happened around the same time as the global fuel crisis, when oil prices, which have always been very volatile, really rocketed. Now, why does global fuel prices impact food prices? Of course, because think of those 70 to 100 trucks coming into Rotorua. The price of fuel impacts on that. And when we have countries around the world where if they can't afford, because of financial collapse at a national governmental level, they can't afford to actually buy the oil needed to fuel the trucks, or they're suffering from natural disasters where they don't have that food coming in on a regular basis, then this has a real impact on everyday living. And in fact, the food crisis has toppled governments, multiple governments around the world. The concept of affordability of the right to food and food actually getting into people's mouths, that has toppled governments. And I think that here in New Zealand, we're not right now at risk of that happening, but that's where there's a huge power in the work that you all do to ensure that the advocacy around this, it has power, it has influence, because governments know if they're not doing enough, then it is enough to cause people to go out onto the street and to protest or to change their vote and to really make an impact in those ways. Some of the other influences that have led to why we have this misbalance between more than enough food being produced in the world, half the world going hungry, is the change in consumer habits. So particularly in areas of the world like China and India, the growth of the affluent middle class and the change in their dietary preferences So the growth of dairy consumption in China and in India, for example, that's changed the nature of the whole food system. It's put more pressure on basic commodities, and it's meant an increase in price because of an increase in demand, which hasn't been matched by other factors in the economy. So the other aspect that's really important to note in that regard, and which is important from an advocacy perspective also, is speculation in the commodities markets. Now, I know that kind of sounds a bit boring, it does to me. At some point I did actually work in a stockbroking firm, yet I find the idea of commodities markets extremely boring, but there you go. But this has been a massive influencing factor as well. So basic commodities such as grains, maize, corn, rice, etc. These are the staples of all of our food baskets globally. These are actually subject to speculative trading, to the futures markets, etc. And one of the ways in which we saw an ability to make policy and to influence change in this regard was to call for a moratorium on speculative trading of basic commodities. Now, that's never happened. It's still something I think could be really valuable in curbing the ways in which commodities traders have an impact on food affordability around the world and upon our ability to feed our people. So it kind of shows another way of legislation to curb some things which are perfectly normal and accepted parts of our capitalist market economy might be some of the solutions, some of the policy and legal solutions to creating change for these things. So those are some of the factors as to why we end up in this situation where we come back home to a town like Rotorua and have half our kids turning up to school without food. Some of the more structural reasons why that happens. We have the legal obligations and systems in place to say it's not good enough that our kids turn up to school without food. And if our government is not taking proactive action or taking action to regulate those who are infringing upon our ability to feed ourselves, then we actually can do something about that from a legal perspective. And I want to be really clear here that it's not just about our government kind of needing to give handouts. It is also about the fact that we need to have a regulatory environment that ensures that we have the ability to feed ourselves. It's not just about how can we give food to everybody. The right to food is not about fulfilling the right to food through the government proactively doing something. It's also about respecting and protecting the right to food. Protect meaning protecting us from third parties who are infringing on that. For example, companies like Monsanto who are impacting on our ability to ensure our seeds are protected from and able to grow and are not protected by trademarks so that farmers can't actually use them and things like that. And respecting from the perspective of ensuring that there are adequate laws in place around evictions from land or the use of land and ensuring that there are incentives and environment that helps our farmers to understand how to farm in a truly sustainable way for all of our people. So that's kind of the legal aspects there and some of the ways in which we can create policy change. Maybe because I don't want to take up too much time, I want to maybe focus now on advocacy. How do we do advocacy around this? So, as I said at the beginning, advocacy is a spectrum, right? I always think of it like this. If we want a particular goal, say our goal is here, that's what we want our society to look like, and we're currently here, we need people to be pushing decision makers to aim here, because we'll always have people here or here. In order to end up here, we need people all along this spectrum so that we end up in that middle bit, right? And we have some places where our governments are the ones that are actually out there being the most progressive, or where we don't have civil society pushing for the stars, so we don't ever get to the moon. So in advocacy, we need the the more extreme activist movements. We need the Greenpeaces, things like that, and then we need the more boring, geeky lawyers like me to have some different ways in which we influence so that we end up with what we want. Which is why, when it comes down to how do we create the future that we want, there's so many different options for us, and it's about you figuring out where your skill set fits best, what you most enjoy, which organisations you feel most comfortable aligning yourself with, and how you can influence the change you want to create. So some of the ways we've already heard about today are legal and policy change, right? So we heard from Angie about the legislation. She was trying to put through a private members bill to ensure that the organisations that donate food are not stuck by the fact that they can't sell it, that they can't donate it for food and safety regulation problems. And I found that really interesting in that work, that co-op that she's doing, I absolutely support. Because about 20 years ago when I was a young lawyer in Melbourne, we put forward a private members bill through Parliament called the Good Samaritan Law, which was exactly that, to basically decriminalise donations of food, or to ensure that people who are companies, businesses, restaurants, etc., who donated food would not be facing liability charges and massive liability as long as the food that they were donating was within certain guidelines. So that idea, so all that was a group literally of 3 of us, first year lawyers, getting together saying, hey, we need to make this change. We weren't members of Parliament, but we could sit there and develop ideas around what we wanted. We then worked with a member of Parliament who thought it was a good idea, wrote the law for her, got that checked by all the people who are actually paid to write laws, and put that through, that she was then able to put that through Parliament. So it is possible to make that change as somebody who literally was my first year ever in practice. In fact, I didn't have my practicing certificate. I was what's called an article clerk. So you can have that change there. You don't have to wait till you're a member of Parliament to do that kind of stuff. So there's that law change. But then there's the other aspects, like using the media, which Kiri was talking about, including social media, that kind of thing. There's the public submissions and consultations. Now, whatever form that takes, I absolutely agree with you that those can be difficult sometimes, and it feels like, oh gosh, how do we access this? How do we influence it? Do people really ever listen? For the gun reform legislation that's being rushed through, 48 hours worth of consultation. On the first day of that 48 hours, they had over 10,000 submissions. Now, that influences them. The reality is, politicians have to listen to what their constituencies want. So if half their constituency is writing, even if it's just one of those pro forma forms where you click on it saying, I support the gun reform laws, they have to listen to it, right? They do care. So making a submission to Parliament doesn't have to be a hugely complex thing. When I was a junior lawyer doing that work around law reform and things, we would make these detailed submissions to Parliament and then be called to give evidence at select committees and go and sit there in our suits and make all these intelligent arguments. And these days, man, it's not that hard. I just put my little social media post on their page and all of a sudden they do listen. So there are all that spectrum of ways you can get involved. Another aspect of that is the traditional forms of advocacy, being protest and petitions and things. As we saw with the youth climate protests the other day, that also gets seen, gets listened to, action takes place because of those kinds of things. So some of the other ones that maybe are a bit more time consuming or a bit more difficult but still incredibly effective in leveraging change are things like legal enforcement campaigns. So taking companies, businesses, governments to court to create change. And we see that with all sorts of different corporations around the world being brought to court, and a lot of the time you hear about some of the ones which are not so successful. What you don't always hear about is the way in which a lot of those legal remedies have created incredible protections for communities of people. Divestment, so using our dollars, whether it's on a really small scale, like for example, I've been collecting just in my months coming back here locally, learning about who are the business owners around town and what are their values and what do they put their support politically and elsewhere. And so then how am I going to spend my dollars here? Things like when I come back into New Zealand and needed to open a KiwiSaver account, I did a lot of research around that. Where is my KiwiSaver being spent? And had to asking my financial advisor about that. And of course, most of them didn't have a clue. But just the fact I'm asking means they have to go and do the research, and they know that consumers care. And I make a decision with my dollars. So divestment, investment in values-based businesses that align with our values and the change that we're trying to create, all those actions. So I don't want to take up all our time. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover, is that, yeah, these things have a legal framework. Issues around the environment are human rights issues, and they're more than human rights issues, but they are also human rights issues, and having that legal framework can be a really valuable advocacy tool, and that advocacy can take all different types along the spectrum. There's no right or wrong way of doing advocacy, but your voice does matter and makes a difference. Questions?
Yeah, I've just got one thing to say. There's more than just the natural environment. And you talk about like the home environment, work environment as well.
Yeah. And there's so many connections between this. In human rights, we call it the interrelatedness and interconnectedness. So if you don't have a home, then you have trouble accessing education and the right to work. And if you don't have food, you have trouble actually using the education. You know, sitting in a classroom that hungry with an empty stomach means that you're not getting the most from your education. So obviously all of these have a big impact on the right to health. So all of these rights, you can't just separate them out and just talk about one without it being a really holistic connection between all of them. In human rights, we call that the interrelatedness and interconnectedness of human rights. And they also impact on what we call our civil and political rights. So, you know, how can you think about who to vote for or going out on the street and exercising your free speech if all of your time and energy is being spent on figuring out how the hell do I find enough food for my family to eat today? You're not going to be somebody who's out there doing community organising if you're focused on how to protect my family from violence, how to find a home, I don't have a job, all those kinds of issues. So it's not, all of those aspects of human rights, including our ability to participate politically and our civil rights, are impacted by the right to food, the right to housing, the right to health, etc.
I think too though, the difficulty is who the hell are you going to sue? So for example...
Oh, okay, that's right. In human rights, it's not actually as nebulous as you think. So you tell me an issue, and I'll tell you...
Well, so for
what
example, dairy products, right to food.
Okay,
So
dairy
we
products
can't afford our cheese because the middle classes in China and in India, you know, it's that whole globalisation thing. Because the pricing isn't set at the local level, it's on the global market, we won't pay as much as the Chinese are going to pay. It therefore pushes the price of the commodity outside of our reach.
Yeah.
How do you get around that?
Okay, so there's different ways that, well, there's a number of different aspects we need to think about. First of all, we have to think about what's the obligation there. The obligation is around ensuring that we have access to affordable, nutritious, etc., all that kind of thing, food. Now, does that mean we have a right to cheese? Well, probably not, right? Because there are other ways in which we can get that same nutrition in our diet. We don't all have to have cheese. But the fact that cheese is unaffordable to us, where's the problem here? The problem is in the fact that one of the obligations we want our government to have is to ensure food affordability for all of our communities. Now, how does the government do that? By regulating to ensure that, regulating domestically around pricing, around subsidies, tariffs, etc., and the way in which it participates in the international trading system, so the international trade system, including the World Trade Organization, to ensure that demand from an export sector does not mean that our domestic market becomes completely unaffordable. So that means that it's up to us to go back to the government. Now, our legal remedies are not always to sue and to take people to court. In this instance, we're looking at failures to act in the regulatory space from a policy perspective. Maybe from a legislative perspective in terms of, for example, in the housing sector, I'll give you a slightly more, cheese is a, can we legislate to make cheese affordable, but housing, it's the same kind of concept. We can put in place laws that cap how much our rents can be increased. And that could be one way of ensuring that housing stays affordable for our whānau. Why couldn't we do the same thing for cheese? to say, okay, the government says to cheese producers, we want our people to have cheese. This is the law around how you can only increase cheese by X amount of percentage per year, or cheese cannot exceed X amount of the, X percentage of the average food basket cost, or something like that. And then that then will impact upon our trading relationships and the way in which we do that. So I'm not saying it's easy, but there are ways in which we can do it, and there are legal and policy potential to ensure no matter what the human rights issue is in terms of environment, that there are solutions out there for us, except the solution for the fact that we're already too late.
Do you feel like, because I really enjoyed your legal definition.
Thanks.
Getting there.
Success. I have a book I can sell you which explains how real detail.
But I guess it was the cultural importance of it.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking too, what's your opinion on the New Zealand government's interpretation of that in regards to the Treaty of Waitangi? Do you feel like they're living up to it, or?
Oh, okay, so that's not for me to say. I'm not Maori. So that's not for me to say whether the treaty is being fulfilled by the New Zealand government from a Maori perspective. I will leave that to others to say. But what I will say is this is what I mean by the concept of human rights. Every single human right that we think about, talk about, it has what we call a normative content. It has not just a definition, but it also has a content that we can understand and apply, and a framework we can apply. So we often talk about the 4 A's and Q in terms of understanding what the human right means. Availability, accessibility, adaptability, affordability. And then depending on which books you read and words you speak to and rights you're looking at, those 4 A's might slightly change, but it's basically that idea. You need to be available physically, financially, whether you live rurally or urban, whether you're rich or poor, etc. Adaptable means culturally appropriate. If we're thinking about education, it needs to be both not just channeling people towards tertiary, but also ensuring that people who don't want to study with books can study with their hands, all that kind of thing. About adaptability, it means when it comes to the right to health, that you're providing a right to health that's religiously appropriate for different members of your community. When it comes to the right to food, culturally appropriate, meaning ensuring all those aspects of the Treaty of Waitangi are lived up to. So there is a legal obligation there, not just in the treaty, but in international human rights law to ensure our treaty obligations are being met. Whether they actually are or not, we all can have opinions. I'm not going to give a judgment. All right, thanks.
Thank you very much for being here. In a minute, we're going to have a 15 minutes break for Kai, but first, we're going to have Kai here. So, thank you, Kai.
I just wanted to say thank you to our speakers. So thank you, Nick, Claire, and to Kiri and Angie, who have already left us. But I'll just say a quick karakia so we can have some fun. So, no mai ngā hua, o papa ahurewa, langi nui, ki te kai, whitiki kia ora, haumie, huie, tāra. Thank you.
All right.